So this is the unbiased history of Israel and Palestine part 2. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, you can go back on this channel and you can click that video because you're going to want that background. In this video, we're going to pick up in the mid-90s through today in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as I said in the first video, a few disclaimers. Number one is there is no such thing truly as an unbiased history, but this is my best attempt at taking some of the best works on this issue and distilling them down into as comprehensive a history as possible that you can get in a few hours. And again, my pronunciations aren't going to be perfect because I don't speak Hebrew or Arabic. And the goal here is to provide as much information as possible in a didactic way. So I'm not trying to be entertaining. I'm not trying to be a great storyteller. I'm just trying to give it to you as it is. And the goal is that you won't be able to determine what my views are on this conflict in watching this video. So let's pick up where we left off. We left off at the Rabin assassination in the mid-90s. His key aide, Shimon Peres, took power. Peres called an early election in February 1996, and he started with a 20% lead in the polls because there was a lot of sympathy and public outpouring of emotion due to Rabin's assassination. But weeks later, there were two suicide bombings on two separate buses in Israel. The first killed 24, the second killed 19, almost all civilians, and then a series of other attacks, and 60 people would be dead in 8 days. And this changed everything. Israeli tanks were deployed along the Green Line for the first time since 1967. Yasser Arafat was facing increased pressure at home. Student elections were held, and Hamas Islamic Jihad won 23 seats to Fatah's 17. And in South Lebanon, Israel had been shelling Hezbollah positions during 5 weeks of cross-border exchanges, and Israel hit a UN base and killed 108 civilians sheltering in an equipment container. So just tons of violence, and this would change the politics both internal to Israel and within the Palestinian territories. Critically, Arab Israeli voters, were 14% of the electorate, responded to all of this with a boycott of the elections, and they called Peres a child murderer and a war criminal. And so Peres's coalition, which had been ascendant and in the lead after Rabin's assassination, lost this critical base of support. But also they were getting hit by the right. Even though the Israeli Arab voters said they weren't going to vote for them, the right wing used the Arab support of Peres against him. So they were in this really, really precarious position. 2 days before the election, Peres's lead was down to 2% in public polls, and he wound up losing by just 29,000 votes. And that leads to the ascension of Netanyahu as prime minister. And he first became prime minister at the age of 46. And, we're now in 2024. He's prime minister. Obviously, he hasn't been prime minister the whole time, which we'll get to. But he was prime minister not much older than I am right now. At the time, I was in middle school, and now he's 74 years old and still prime minister. And a lot of people felt like Yitzhak Rabin's leadership and his coalition was the most left-wing Israel had ever had and probably has ever had. Netanyahu's was at the time viewed as the most right-wing coalition in Israeli history up to that point, and that was 1996. In his inaugural speech, he pledged to encourage settlement development in areas on the other side of the Green Line. He said, quote, "The settlers are the real pioneers of our day, and they deserve support and appreciation." In August, the cabinet voted to lift restrictions on settlements. In September, Netanyahu approved the opening by archaeologists of a new entrance to the tunnel linking Via Dolorosa and the Western Wall, which is not far from the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The issue had been the subject of passionate negotiation for a decade. Netanyahu made his decision against warnings from his security chiefs. We'll link in the show notes to this documentary called Netanyahu at War that Frontline did, and they did a whole series, like a whole sort of breakout on this particular Via Dolorosa issue. And what you will see is, for lack of a better way of putting it, Netanyahu's sort of skill at instigation. And he almost is winking at the camera when he talks about his explanation for what he was doing at Via Dolorosa. And I'll leave it to you to interpret what he was doing there. Clashes erupted around the mosque in response to this, with 7 Palestinians dead. Then Israel deployed copters and tanks to the territories, killing 44 Palestinians. Clinton summoned Netanyahu and Arafat to D.C., and at this point, Netanyahu decided not to outright oppose Oslo, but to slow walk it, which is a strategy he would employ for the next few decades. Netanyahu pushed ahead with aggressive settlement development, including a 6,500-unit, 30,000-person settlement, as well as a road and tunnel that allowed direct access from Jerusalem to the Gush Etzion settlement, bypassing Palestinian towns who were not permitted to use that route. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, responded by breaking off contact. At this point, Arafat was facing tremendous heat over the settlement construction from his own people. The writer Sari Nusseibeh at the time wrote, "Israeli leaders' tearful declarations of peace didn't tally with what they were doing with their bulldozers." In July of 1997, suicide bombers struck the packed Mahane Yehuda market in West Jerusalem, killing 13 and triggering a closure of the West Bank and Gaza, as well as an Israeli suspension of negotiations. In September, another bombing killed 5 Israelis and injured 180. The Yediot Ahronoth columnist Nahum Barnea, whose son had died a year earlier in a bus bombing, wrote, quote, "Arafat has gone from being a peace partner to a declared enemy. The only light at the end of the tunnel is the flash of the next terrorist blast." Israeli intelligence claimed that Arafat had freed a senior Qassam commander to signal to terrorists that he was giving them the green light for attacks. Netanyahu got into hot water at home and abroad when the Mossad botched the assassination of a senior Hamas leader in Jordan, causing the agents to flee to the Israeli embassy. The king of Jordan had his troops surround the embassy, and to get their agents out, the Israelis had to cut a deal and release a prisoner whom the PLO had been agitating for. It is a crazy story that we don't have time to get into, involving antidotes to poison and yada, yada, yada. You could read all about it. But not all was bad at that period of time. In the final few years of the 90s, the Shin Bet and the Palestinian Authority Preventive Security Service developed close ties and carried out some joint operations. The U.S. also developed stronger ties to the Palestinian Authority, with the CIA training their security. However, the Palestinian Authority became increasingly corrupt during this period of time. Arafat and his allies controlled imports of cement, electricity, fuel, flour, tobacco, and they'd collect a percentage. For example, the price of a ton of cement was $74, of which $17 went to the Palestinian Authority and $17 went to Arafat's bank account. So the same amount that went to the Palestinian Authority government went to Arafat himself and his slush fund. This was happening as the Palestinian Authority was using aggressive policing methods, often locking up people without due process and slim evidence. This included journalists, civil society figures, and academics. An internal inquiry reported in 1997 that half that year's $326 million budget had been misspent, mismanaged, and embezzled. This helped change the perception on the ground of the Palestinians of their own leadership. An opinion poll from the period of time found that 56% of Palestinians believed their political institutions were corrupt. Boss built, he leaned into this perception in many ways. He built a conspicuous multi-million-dollar mansion in Gaza. Someone scrawled on the wall in front of the mansion, quote, "This is your reward for selling Palestine." Between 1995 and 1997, unemployment in Gaza was between 24 to 39%, so crushing unemployment. Yet Clinton kept pushing for progress between Netanyahu and Arafat, and in September 1998, he got the two to have another summit, and Netanyahu agreed to 3 more phases of Israeli military redeployment, comprising 13% of the West Bank being transferred. And the PLO pledged to convene the Palestine National Council to recognize Israel's right to exist. And Clinton visited Gaza in December 1998, which is amazing to think about today. Gaza was and obviously is a very dangerous place for outsiders. But Clinton went there and he gave a speech talking about how the recognition of Israel sent a powerful message to the people of Israel. And Netanyahu faced dissent from the right, believe it or not, who hated the concessions, and from the left that was unhappy with the slow pace of negotiations. Another Israeli right-wing leader who I talked about in the last video, Ariel Sharon, called on West Bank settlers to, quote, move, run, and grab as many hilltops as you can to enlarge settlements because everything we take now will stay ours. Keep Sharon in mind because we think of the Israeli right as being dominated by Netanyahu, but actually at the period of time, even though Netanyahu was prime minister, Ariel Sharon is kind of the big dog in Israeli right-wing politics. In December 1998, the Knesset voted to dissolve itself and hold new elections, and Ehud Barak became the prime minister in May 1999, and he was a member of the Labor Party, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres's party. He was the most decorated soldier in the country's history. He had been Rabin's interior minister, yet he opposed Oslo at the time. But during the election, he promised to continue Rabin's legacy. He initially kept the status quo, which included settlement construction. But in June of 2000, as Clinton was about to leave office, he held a news summit. And Barak's coalition at the time in the Knesset was falling apart. This was a period of time in which it was very hard to hold on to power as an Israeli leader. The country was bitterly divided. Barak decided to roll everything up and go big. He offered 92% of the West Bank, and through land swaps was able to piece together a map. And for the first time, he offered to accept some Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem and Palestinian custodianship of Haram al-Sharif with Palestinian security on the ground, but with Israeli sovereignty. Small numbers of refugees would be allowed back. The Israeli negotiator Ben Ami told Arafat during these negotiations that, quote, I am not denying the morality of your demand for the right of return. However, we must together seek a formula whereby the right of return becomes symbolic. Arafat did not accept the deal, though details are murky on how he communicated that and how it was communicated to him. This is a huge area of historic dispute. I would be in college a few years after this, and this was the debate. Did Arafat walk away from this plan or not? A lot of people feel like there are really high stakes for how you come down on this issue. There was little written down during these negotiations for fear of leaks, which doesn't help. The Palestinian interpretation was there was no contiguity, no full sovereignty over East Jerusalem, and not enough refugees. The Israeli view is that Barak went further than any leader had done before. He went beyond his own red lines. He broke taboos like control over Jerusalem, and Arafat didn't come with any meaningful or specific counter, that he simply dragged his feet. Let me just pause there for a second and say what's going on here is Barak, his coalition is under pressure from the Israeli right, which, Barak had razor-thin margins. And so he's basically betting the farm there. And actually, Barak has basically, never sniffed the prime ministership since. Arafat, at the time, was facing increased pressure from Hamas and other more radical figures within the Palestinian territories. So with each passing year, and you'll feel this, the walls are closing in on anybody who wants peace. It's getting harder and harder and harder, and the amount of territory that's on the table will never be more than that 92% that the Israelis say that they offered during this negotiation. A few days later, Ariel Sharon, who replaced Netanyahu as the Likud leader, visited Temple Mount and Haram al-Sharif. He claimed he wanted to, quote, inspect the archaeological sites. He later admitted that his real intention was to highlight how Ehud Barak was prepared to give away Israel's sovereignty at Camp David. The visit was incendiary and chaotic. You could watch the video online. 1,000 police and young Palestinians were throwing stones, chairs. No one was killed, though. But in the days after, violence erupted into what would become the second Intifada, so the second uprising. So the first one was in the late 80s to the early 90s, and now we have the second Intifada. And it really breaks out starting in September 30th. A 12-year-old boy was shot in the Gaza Strip in a crossfire between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian security, and it was the subject of a fierce debate as to who was responsible for the death. Which bullets hit him? The scene was viewed by millions on TV, and over the next few days, 13 Israeli Arab citizens were killed, mostly young people, as protests spread in Israel and violence and recrimination began. In October of 2000, hundreds of Israelis tore down the walls of a derelict mosque in what had been an Arab village until 1948. 2 Israeli soldiers were lynched by a mob at a police station in Ramallah, with Palestinian Authority police unwilling to intervene. And in the 3 weeks after the start of the Intifada, the IDF fired 1 million bullets into the occupied territories, and they killed at least 8 children under the age of 16. In November of 2000, Barak announced early general elections. He was getting heat from the right for being too soft and heat internationally for being too extreme. Ariel Sharon won the election as a member of the Likud party, and he became prime minister in February 2001. This was the end of Oslo, for all practical purposes. Sharon became prime minister as killings continued. Israel assassinated one of Arafat's bodyguards in Gaza, and a Gazan bus driver intentionally ran over 8 civilians at a bus stop. A Hamas suicide bomber killed 3 Israelis in Netanya. A 10-month-old baby in Hebron, a child of Jewish settlers, was killed by a Palestinian sniper as she sat in her pushchair. 6 months into the Intifada, 70 Israelis had been killed, hundreds injured, 350 Palestinians had been killed, thousands injured. Settlers were still not happy with Sharon, though. He was facing pressure, believe it or not, again from the right. The settlers dropped a bullet-ridden car outside his office to send a message. Sharon then formed a unity government, basically saying he was kind of fed up with trying to placate the right, which was a fascinating turn for Sharon and is subject to a lot of debate about what his true intentions were. And he formed a government including Shimon Peres, who became the foreign minister. Remember, Shimon Peres was, for a brief period of time, the Labor prime minister, and he had been the key deputy to Rabin. Sharon sent his son to Gaza to offer Arafat a temporary state on 42% of the West Bank and a ceasefire. Remember, Barak's camp said he had offered 92% of the West Bank. So within a few short years, he went from 42% to 92% to 42%. The Israeli intelligence reported in February 2001 that Arafat had secretly given the go-ahead for a wave of suicide bombings. Arafat gave a rare interview at the time in which he denied this, but he hinted that he could stop the attacks if he wanted to. One of his aides, Mohammed Dalan, later said of this period that, quote, Arafat would condemn operations by day, while at night he would do honorable things. In April of 2001, Sharon ordered his tanks into Gaza. George Mitchell, a key American figure at the time, former U.S. Senator, had been commissioned by the U.S. to study the conflict, and he issued his findings. He said that Sharon's Temple Mount walkabout did not cause the Intifada, but he rejected the claim that Arafat instigated the unrest, but noted that Arafat did little to stop it. The Palestinian analyst Yazid Saig said that reactions triggered by Sharon provided Arafat, quote, with an escape from his predicament. In Mitchell's report, he gave a summary that said that the Israelis and Palestinians don't seem to fully appreciate each other's problems and concerns, and that the Israelis do not comprehend the humiliation and frustration. He said that the Palestinians don't comprehend how terrorism creates fear and undermines Israel's belief in its coexistence. He said, quote, the danger of all of this is that the culture of peace, nurtured over the previous decade, is being shattered. Life during the Intifada was harsh. There were so many checkpoints, and it often would turn what should be short journeys into odysseys by car, foot, even donkey. Unemployment in Gaza during critical periods of time neared 50%. In June of 2001, suicide bombings at a beachfront nightclub in Tel Aviv killed 21, mostly girls, and Hamas claimed responsibility. Arafat denounced the attack and then announced a ceasefire. 2 of the plotters of the attack were killed along with 2 children in an Apache attack. And in August, another 15 Israelis, including 7 children, died in a suicide attack on a Sbarro pizza. Hamas claimed responsibility. In an odd side note, that attack, the Sbarro attack, Islamic Jihad also claimed responsibility, right? So Hamas and this organization, Islamic Jihad, claimed responsibility. But later, Islamic Jihad realized that they had sent a suicide bomber en route to somewhere else at the same time. So they were confused about their own suicide bombing. To give you a sense of just the sheer quantity of activity going on, that these guys didn't even know what they were bombing. Israel took out a number of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and PFLP leaders at the time. On September 10th, 2001, an ominous date, 7 people were killed in 3 separate attacks in the space of 5 hours, including one by an Israeli Arab citizen, which was a first, right? You have these Israeli Arab citizens living side by side with Jewish Israelis. This was a turning point in the perceptions and created a hostile climate for many in Israel. The Bush White House pushed a ceasefire, which lasted only a few days before the Palestinians renounced it, shortly followed by Sharon. Needless to say, in the post-9/11 environment, there's probably very little sympathy for suicide attacks and terrorist activity before September 11th. After September 11th, the valence gets turned up pretty significantly. Bush also called for the creation of a Palestinian state during this period of time, which drew a rebuke from Sharon. The White House called Sharon's statement unacceptable. In mid-December, Arafat went on Palestinian TV to warn that the Palestinian Authority would punish anyone who violated his orders and planned a suicide bombing or mortar fire. That led to a 3-week period of quiet, which helps underscore the belief that many had in Israel that Arafat could turn on the spigot of terrorism or turn it off whenever he wanted. The Israelis assassinated a wanted bomb maker and plotter, and the assassination was opposed by the IDF and former Shin Bet leaders because they were basically trying to get a ceasefire to last, and they warned Sharon that it would jeopardize the truce, this operation. And it did. It led to a new round of suicide bombings. A few days later, Palestinians walked into a bar mitzvah and shot 6 dead. This led to a prolonged back and forth with many civilian casualties. In January of 2002, the Israelis intercepted a freighter carrying $50 million worth of weapons from Iran to Gaza, and Arafat denied knowledge, which many observers found hard to believe. The peak of this second Intifada was around the spring of 2002. In March 27th of that year, a Hamas bomber killed 29 elderly Israelis who were celebrating Passover in Netanyahu. The bombing triggered Operation Defensive Shield, which is the biggest Israeli operation in the West Bank since 1967. They called up 20,000 men. Almost every town was reoccupied, which was a throwback to the pre-Oslo days. Thousands of Palestinians were arrested, many killed. And in Ramallah, Israeli troops exchanged fire with Arafat's bodyguards. They surrounded his headquarters with bulldozers and cut off his power. Fighting broke out in the Jenin refugee camp, and 23 Israeli soldiers were dead, 52 Palestinians. This violence lasted a month, $360 million in damage, according to the World Bank, were inflicted across the territories, with 250 to 500 dead, mostly Palestinian security. In June, a spat of new suicide bombings led to another smaller incursion called Operation Determined Path. And Bush was basically at a breaking point. And in June 24th, he called for Arafat to go. And in July, an Israeli jet bombed the Gaza home of a Qassam Brigade commander, killing him and 14 others, including 9 children. This led to international condemnation, and subsequent Israeli investigations found that there were intelligence failures, but no intention to kill civilians. This did little to kill the speculation that Sharon was trying to sabotage the peace talks. Ian Black said at the period of time, quote, "The Al-Aqsa Intifada's violence took a dreadful toll on mutual empathy and understanding, which is always in short supply between Palestinians and Israelis. If the dominant image of the first Intifada was Palestinian children throwing stones, the symbol of the second was the suicide bomber." In late 2002, polling showed a sense of despondency among the Palestinians. 51% of Palestinians rejected military operations, terrorism, as harmful to the Palestinian national interest. They were fed up with it all. They coined a new term called Intifada, which combined Intifada with Fauda, which means chaos. Also happens to be the name of a Netflix show. In June of 2002, the Israeli cabinet voted to begin construction of a new separation fence. Polling showed large public support within Israel for the fence. It was part fence, part concrete wall. It was up to 24 feet high with barbed wire, sensors, cameras, towers. The first section was completed in the summer of 2003. I remember being in college at this period of time, and this was the big debate, the fence, the wall, right? Palestinians protested, calling it an apartheid wall. According to the UN, only 15% of the wall followed the Green Line, while the rest cut up to 11 miles of the West Bank, leaving many Palestinians isolated from the rest of their territory. The economic implications of the fence made it even harder to work. Between 2001 to 2002, Palestinian GDP shrunk 40%. Bush continued to push ahead for peace. He floated what was called the Roadmap for Peace, but he and British Prime Minister Tony Blair were distracted by Afghanistan and Iraq, and you get the sense of this period of time that they never really threw their back into peace in Israel and Palestine, because they were so, this was the height of the quagmire of Iraq. Israeli troops at various points surrounded Arafat's compound, and they had him under siege. Mahmoud Abbas, a key Arafat aide, became the Palestinian prime minister. Hamas condemned him as the Karzai of Palestine in reference to the Afghanistan leader Hamid Karzai, who was viewed as corrupt and a stooge of the United States. Abbas soon found himself in conflict with Arafat over jobs and cronies. He was temporarily replaced by Corrier, who is the Speaker of the Legislative Council. During this period of time, Palestinian suicide bombings and Israeli assassinations kept on. In June of 2003, Israel tried and failed to kill a Hamas leader in Gaza. A day later, a teenage Hamas bomber dressed as an Orthodox Jew killed 16 people on a rush hour bus in Jerusalem. 20 more Israelis died in October during a bombing of a restaurant in Haifa. Gaza was not reoccupied, but was subject to raids targeting terrorists. Often these would go wrong, including an incident in March of 2003 that killed a pregnant woman in a refugee camp. In that same month, an American student named Rachel Corrie was crushed to death by an Israeli bulldozer in Rafah. 2 British visitors, one an activist and one a journalist, were also killed by the IDF around the same time. In December of 2003, Sharon shocked many by calling for a full withdrawal of troops and settlements from Gaza. The right wing opposed this. Gaza never had the same draw as the West Bank to the Israelis because there are fewer holy sites, fewer resources, less territory. Around that time, Sharon also used the word occupation to describe actions in the territories. Sharon also commissioned a report on settlement activity. Talia Sassone, a former state attorney, cataloged how government departments had, without authorization, allocated funding to dozens of outposts on private Palestinian land in moves that were under illegal Israeli law. Washington and the Palestinian Authority were suspicious of Sharon's motives at the time, and I honestly haven't been able to get a good read on it from the history. It's really hard to figure out what was going on with Sharon here, who is viewed, like, whatever you think of Netanyahu today, think of that in spades with Sharon. He was viewed as this intransigent old veteran of the right, who was as much an obstacle to peace as anybody. He was starting to soften, though, at least in perceptions. He did keep on at that period of time with construction of the wall. He didn't want Hamas to declare victory for the Gaza pullout, and so he started killing a succession of Hamas leaders. In late 2003, critically, Arafat suffered a heart attack, and in October of 2004, he collapsed and lost consciousness. He was flown to Paris for treatment, and he fell into a coma and died on November 11th. His widow suspected poison, but forensics investigators found he died of a brain hemorrhage and intestinal infection. According to Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian Authority, Arafat's death, quote, was marked with both sadness and relief among Palestinians, a sense of anxiety at the disappearance of the only leader most people have ever known, combined with a sense that change was imperative after so many years of going nowhere. Resentment at a father figure had clung to his power for too long, was accompanied by deep insecurity at the disappearance of the icon who symbolized the Palestinian cause. In January of 2005, Abbas was elected to replace Arafat as president of the Palestinian Authority and chairman of the PLO. And in February, Abbas and Sharon met in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt and agreed to a ceasefire. Islamic Jihad and Hamas insisted they weren't bound by that ceasefire, but agreed to respect a tadiyah, meaning a period of calm. This was widely recognized as the end of the Second Intifada. And this led to the evacuation of Gaza, which began in mid-August 2005 and wrapped up a month later. Most Gaza settlers, like Israeli settlers in Gaza, left peacefully, but some had to be dragged onto buses, while others barricaded themselves and threw paint at troops. It's an important period of time to keep in mind because, if a lot of people believe if there's any hope of peace today, there will have to be some removal of settlements in the West Bank to create some contiguity for the Palestinians. And this will give you a sense of what it would look like. Some people leaving on their own, some acrimony and violence. The Israelis demolished 2,800 settler homes. They maintained full control over Gaza's borders as well as the air and sea. The historian Ian Black said that Hamas was on the rise at this point because the lives of the Palestinians become dominated by the 3 Gs: guns, gates, and guards. And you now add to that a 4th G, God, and that 4th G was starting to dominate life in the territories, especially under Hamas, who imposed strict Islamic laws in the Gaza Strip, severely limiting personal freedoms. Women were expected to wear conservative Islamic attire to cover their hair and bodies. They'd been harassed or detained for not adhering to those dress codes. Homosexuality was and is considered a crime under the laws that Hamas enforces. Those suspected of being gay or lesbian risked arrest, torture, and even execution in extreme cases. Public discussions of LGBTQ rights are suppressed. It creates an atmosphere of fear and discrimination for that community. Islamic fundamentalism underpins, the core tenets of Hamas's governance, and we'll link to the show notes to a whole episode of the Lost Debate podcast that I did on Hamas, their history, their beliefs, how they've changed over the years, their record. But their goal, in short, is to create a theocratic state based on a strict interpretation of Islamic law, or Sharia. And this involves not just the legal underpinnings of society, but also its education. School curricula includes religious teachings promoting jihad and martyrdom, and the judicial system is molded by fundamentalist views with punishments like amputations and public executions for crimes such as theft or apostasy. The charter for Hamas, the original charter, called for the destruction of Israel and encouraged all good Muslims to kill Jews. They amended that charter just recently in 2017. Around that time, right, so taking it back to the reign of Sharon, Hamas Foreign Minister Mahmoud al-Zahar said, quote, "Israel is a vile entity that has been planted on our soil and has no historical, religious, or cultural legitimacy. We cannot normalize our relations with this entity. We say no to recognizing Israel, regardless of the price we pay for a refusal." About $1 billion a year in foreign aid was coming into the Palestinian territories during this period of time. It was the highest per capita aid for anywhere in the world. Ramallah was described by some as a boom town during this period of time. Nicer restaurants, hotels, apartments, villas. There was a new elite within the Palestinian territories, and this fed resentment and accusations of corruption. Incomes in 2005 were 31% lower than in 1999 in the territories, and unemployment was at 25%, despite all this aid coming in. Some observers called it a fake economy. One local businessman said, quote, "It's artificial. It depends on foreign aid, and we've seen what happens when it stops. The government employees go without salaries." There were tons of checkpoints, 10 separate areas of the West Bank, so it was totally, sliced up. Nassim Levy, who spent years working for the Shin Bet, put it eloquently, saying, quote, "If a boy from Bethlehem falls in love with a girl from Nablus, what does he do? He has to cross checkpoints. He needs 1,001 permits. The moment you reach that conclusion that you have nothing to live for, you immediately find you have something to die for." The West Bank barrier was a target of regular protests, sometimes joined by left-wing Israelis. In 2004, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion that was that the barrier was contrary to international law. Left-wing Israeli organizations during this period of time began to grow and take on greater prominence. Gisha, which means access, was set up in 2005 to deal with the freedom of movement issues. Yedin, there is justice, used volunteers to shine a light on human rights in the occupied territories. And in November of 2005, Sharon left Likud and founded Kadima, which is the Forward Party. This was billed as more centrist, so this was another step in the direction of these perceptions that perhaps Sharon was moderating. Ehud Olmert and Tzipi Livni, who was the former Minister of Justice, joined that party. there were new possibilities with this realignment. Perhaps this could reignite the hopes of peace. But in January of 2006, Sharon suffered a stroke and sank into a coma. He was permanently incapacitated. He'd never be back. Olmert led Kadima to victory 2 months later. You can think of him kind of as a centrist figure within Israeli politics. Abbas called the first elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council since 1996. Hamas took part with ads focused on Palestinian Authority corruption. There was 77% turnout for this election. Hamas won 42.9% of the vote to Fatah's 45%. So Fatah narrowly had a plurality of the vote. Abbas was still president, but now needed legislative approval for the budgets, etc. And what you'll see is that he started to basically ignore Hamas and cut them out of the decision-making during this period of time. The Quartet, which is the U.S., EU, UN, and Russia, who are basically the people who would try to push for peace, deemed Hamas a terrorist organization, slashed financial support for the Palestinian Authority, while Israel withheld tax revenues it collected on its behalf, basically in response to Hamas now being part of the government, because they've been funneling all these resources to the government, and they're now saying, hey, if Hamas is going to be part of this government, we can't give you resources anymore. This led to Palestinian Authority employees not being able to get paid. Hamas members of parliament had to be sworn in via video link because they couldn't leave Gaza. And in the summer of 2006, violence would explode again at a whole new level. In July of 2006, a 12-year-old Palestinian boy and his grandmother and 2 cousins were killed by an artillery shell fired by Israeli soldiers at what they believed were Qassam rockets coming from nearby. Later that afternoon, an 11-year-old girl was killed by a shell. This led to a huge flare-up of violence. Hamas renounced their easing of tensions. They said Zionists must, quote, prepare their coffins or their luggage. In June 25th, the Palestinian fighters tunneled underground under a kibbutz. They killed 2 IDF members and took 1 hostage. This is critical. The hostage is named Gilad Shalit. Remember that name? This is the first IDF soldier captured by Palestinians in over a decade. This led to Operation Summer Rains, which was approved by Olmert. And the goal was to free Shalit, halt the Qassam fire, and disarm all terrorist groups. This started with air raids and arrests in Gaza. And I remember I was abroad at this period of time watching this on the BBC, and it was unbelievable what you were seeing on the TV. By mid-July, Lebanon's Hezbollah, in solidarity with Hamas, mounted a raid on Israel's northern border, killing 3 Israeli soldiers and capturing 2 others. 5 more soldiers were killed inside Lebanon in a failed rescue operation. This was basically the beginning of a second Lebanon war, which was to take place on the same terrain as the first. It lasted 34 days with the Israeli ground invasion of the south. Hezbollah fighters were equipped with modern anti-tank missiles. 240 Hezbollah rockets hit inside Israel, 1,300 dead Lebanese and 165 Israelis. There were lots of civilian deaths. This was a 2-front war in Gaza and Lebanon, in 2 territories that Israel had unilaterally withdrawn from. So this, is going to have an effect on the psyche of Israelis and whether they will ever withdraw again. It's something relevant when you think about the territory that they've recently taken. In September, Abbas and Ismail Haniyeh, who was the Hamas leader, agreed to form a unity government but couldn't find a common stance towards Israel. The U.S. was channeling its security assistance directly to Abbas's presidential guard at this period of time, not the Palestinian Authority. But remember, it's kind of like a rock and a hard place here. You have Hamas with all the terrible beliefs that I just described, but then you also had the Palestinian Authority, which had a history of corruption. Clashes continued. In November, the IDF shells killed 19 Palestinians and wounded 40 in the Bet Hanun because of what the Israelis dubbed a technical malfunction in response to Hamas, to Qassam rocket fire. In February 2007, the Saudis brokered the formation of a unity government, and the U.S. and Israel opposed it. Hamas refused to end rocket fire. Jaish al-Islam, which helped capture Gilad Shalit, so the Israeli soldier, kidnapped also the BBC's Gaza correspondent Alan Johnston, who ironically had reported on the danger of unemployed militants with time on their hands. So basically he was writing, hey, like these people don't have jobs and they're getting into a lot of trouble, and he himself got into some of that trouble. At the time, Shin Bet's security chief described Fatah as desperate, disorganized, and demoralized, and the crisis worsened, with Islamists taking over the entire Gaza Strip. Hamas threw an officer of the Palestinian Presidential Guard off of a 15-story building, and Fatah men retaliated, doing the same to a Hamas official. Gaza was absolute hell during that period of time. It never was and never has been since a great place to live, but it was particularly bad then. Hamas seized Abbas's Gaza City compound, and a Hamas fighter lounged in Abbas's fancy office and mocked him and pretended to make a call to the U.S. Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. Abbas declared a state of emergency and dissolved the government, and a key figure would emerge during this period of time named Salam Fayyad, who is a Texas-educated economist who worked for the IMF and who had been the Palestinian Authority's finance minister, and he was appointed to replace Haniyeh, so basically as the second in command. And a lot of people believe that Fayyad was the most competent, ethical leader the Palestinian Authority ever had. I actually had a chance to meet him when I worked at the UN, roughly about this period of time. Once Obama came to office, I visited the Palestinian authorities in Israel in that first year of the Obama administration, and you could just tell there was a level of respect for Fayyad and a level of trust in him that no leader before or since had enjoyed in those areas. Back to that period of time, though, the territories were split. Gaza was to Hamas and the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority and Fatah. Western allies pledged their support for Abbas, suspending aid projects in Gaza and lifting the boycott for the Palestinian Authority. Olmert implored the U.S. to treat Gaza and the West Bank separately from there forward, breaking a link that had been the bedrock since Oslo. So really it wasn't the Palestinians negotiating with the Israelis. It was the West Bank / Palestinian Authority negotiating with Israelis, and then a whole separate dynamic with Gaza and Hamas. Bush said he would only treat the two, make that split, meaning treating Gaza and the West Bank separately, if Israel made concessions to improve the quality of life in the West Bank. In July of 2007, Bush announced a new effort to restart peace talks. He invited Syria and Saudi Arabia to get regional support, who were, in the eyes of one commentator, strikingly unenthusiastic about being involved in peace. During this period of time, Olmert promised to freeze settlement construction, but in practice he did not. In December 2007, there was a donor conference in Paris that allocated $7.2 billion to the Palestinian Authority, and this was the lead up to what were called the Annapolis talks, named after the town in Maryland. But everyone was weak heading into these negotiations. So Olmert was facing corruption charges dating back to his time as mayor of Jerusalem. Abbas had lost half his territory to Hamas. Bush was embroiled in Iraq. And so you take those figures who are at the table for these negotiations and compare them to Clinton, Rabin, Arafat, or even Barack. It was quite the change, right? You had a bunch of figures now at the table who didn't have the energy, the legitimacy, the political support, the oxygen to do much. At Annapolis, Olmert gave a moving speech about Palestinian suffering. He and Abbas declared their goal to reach agreement on Palestinian statehood before Bush left office in January 2009. Tony Blair, who was now no longer the prime minister, but was now a Middle East envoy, and he was the envoy for the Quartet again, which is the UN, EU, US, and Russia. He adopted what was called a West Bank First strategy that was bullish on Fayyad's focus on institution building, infrastructure, governance, and security. But violence continued. In January 2008, 267 rockets and 256 mortars were fired across the border, injuring 9 Israelis. Peace talks were cordial, but were stuck on issues of settlements and refugees. In August, Olmert offered Abbas a take-it-or-leave-it deal that included near total withdrawal from all but 5.8% of the West Bank. Palestinians would be compensated with a swap of Israeli land equivalent to 5.8% of the West Bank. The old city of Jerusalem would be placed under international control. During these heated talks, Olmert showed Abbas a map and pressed him to agree on the spot. Abbas balked. Israelis argued afterwards that Abbas, much like Arafat with Ehud Barak, missed a historic opportunity. The Palestinians argued that the deal would have been worthless because Olmert was a lame duck who was about to resign due to criminal charges. There's much speculation at the time that Olmert was looking for a Hail Mary pass to remove the stain of his corruption charges. Olmert would eventually be convicted and serve time in prison. This led to this sort of failed talks led to what was called Operation Cast Lead. This was an Israeli operation with the goal to end Palestinian rocket fire and arms smuggling. It started on November 4th, 2008, the day of Obama's election. The IDF killed 6 Hamas men who were digging a tunnel. Hamas retaliated, firing dozens of rockets into Israel. In December of 2027, Hamas had been lured into a false sense of security. Israel was kind of pretending to be quiet, but then they hit 100 targets within minutes. The death toll that day was 230. Dozens of tunnels under the border with Egypt were destroyed. And in January 3rd, 2009, Israel started a ground offensive. And that ended on January 18th, 2 days before Obama took office, with Israel unilaterally announcing a ceasefire and Hamas following suit a few hours later. Palestinian casualties of that operation were over 1,000, including 400 children. Coverage of that operation was colored by the rise of blogs and social media, which filled the gap that was left due to the inability of traditional media to cover effectively. The IDF launched a YouTube page which showed drone footage. Abbas was said to have privately urged Israelis to, quote, continue the military campaign and overthrow Hamas. And there's a lot of speculation that there's a lot of intelligence out there where Abbas is basically, sounding like a member of the Israeli and U.S. coalition, and basically encouraging them to take out Hamas. The aftermath was colored by recriminations over the war. There was a report being commissioned at the UN, and this is when I was at the UN. It was called the Goldstone Report, written by Goldstone, who if I remember correctly, was a South African jurist, and that was very critical of Israel. And Israel and the United States were working to try to beat back that report because there's this belief that the United Nations is biased against Israel, and that they spend a lot of, a sort of disproportionate amount of time criticizing Israel relative to other, much more noteworthy human rights abusers. Put that aside for now. During that period of time, the West Bank maintained peace throughout, and a lot of the Israeli army went from the West Bank to Gaza for fighting because they trusted the Palestinian Authority. In June of 2009, Obama gave a speech in Cairo where he described his relationship with Israel as unbreakable and the situation for Palestinians as intolerable. There were no new ideas in the speech, but he did say that settlements were illegitimate, and he called on Hamas to end violence. He said, quote, "It is a sign neither of courage nor power to shoot rockets at sleeping children or to blow up old women on a bus." Tzipi Livni, Olmert's successor for Kadima, narrowly won the 2009 elections, but the Gaza war boosted the right wing, and Netanyahu was asked to form a new government. And his foreign minister was Avigdor Lieberman, who was a hard-right figure who lived in a West Bank settlement and campaigned on a promise to have Israel's Arab citizens swear an oath of loyalty to Israel as a Jewish state or lose their citizenship. Barak led Labor, but they were now reduced to just 13 seats in the Knesset. George Mitchell, again, that former Democratic senator who was a veteran of the Northern Ireland peace process, was again named Middle East envoy. He pushed for a peace deal, but Netanyahu added a new demand that Palestinians formally recognize Israel as a Jewish state before negotiating a two-state solution. PLO had formally recognized Israel at Oslo, but now felt they were being asked to endorse Zionism itself. Obama and Hillary demanded a total freeze on settlements, and Israeli right-wingers would chant. They did not like Obama. They would chant Saddam Hussein Obama at rallies. Needless to say, Netanyahu and Obama did not have a great relationship, nor did Clinton and Netanyahu. In November, Netanyahu agreed to a 10-month moratorium that was heavily qualified and excluded East Jerusalem and construction already underway that was essential to normal life. Days later, he told settlers that building would resume as soon as his suspension was over. Abbas refused to enter negotiations unless the issue was resolved. In January of 2010, Mossad agents using British and Australian passports killed Mahmoud Mabou, who was the chief of logistics and weapons procurement for Hamas in a Dubai hotel, but they were caught on CCTV footage. It's quite amazing to see. The boycotts, disinvestments, and sanctions movement grew around that time, the BDS movement, they call it. There was a campaign not just to target the settlements or businesses that were directly involved in occupation, but all Israeli institutions, arguing that they were complicit. They opposed any normalization with Israelis, and they wanted a one-state solution. The Palestinian Authority did not back BDS, but did back a boycott of anything that the settlements produced. Fayyad was still kind of on the scene at this period of time, and he gained international support for his state-building strategy. There was a growing middle class in the West Bank under Fayyad, which was helped by cheap bank loans for homes and cars. Even Gaza during that period was calmer than usual. Rocket launches were down from 2,048 in 2008 to 150. Now, in February 2011, the U.S. cast its veto against the UN Security Council resolution condemning the Israeli settlements. It was drafted by Britain, Germany, and France. The Obama administration insisted that settlements were illegitimate instead of illegal. So they were parsing their language there a bit. From 2010 to 2011, the Arab Spring motivated rallies in the West Bank, calling for an end to the split with Gaza and new elections. Abbas's term had expired 2 years earlier, but he was still ruling, while Fayyad's appointment as prime minister hadn't even been confirmed by parliament. Gaza also saw protests against Hamas's repression and religious fundamentalism and their social norms. Hamas fired dozens of mortar shells into Israel in March 2011 to deflect from the internal resistance. And when bin Laden was eventually killed, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh hailed bin Laden as a mujahid, a holy warrior, which obviously didn't do much to engender him to any sympathizers in the West. In May, Fatah and Hamas agreed to a new date for unity elections. Fatah nominated Fayyad, who was the preference of the EU and US, but Hamas opposed him. The opponents, grew to prominence, who didn't want security cooperation with Israel to affect their tunnels. So people, it's a lot of the sort of Hamas type figures, because they didn't want the end of tunnels, which were huge revenue generators for them and a source of power. One Hamas official said, quote, "The siege is a blessing in disguise. It's weaning us off Israel and 60 years of aid and helping us to ourselves." Abbas was facing a deadlock from Israel and Hamas, so he sought UN recognition of Palestinian statehood. He faced strong opposition from the U.S. and didn't get enough votes, but he was hailed as a hero at home for attempting it. In October 2011, Hamas released that IDF soldier, Gilad Shalit, who had been captured in 2006, so he spent somewhere like 5 years in captivity. And this exchange would be really important. So in exchange for Shalit, one guy, Israel released 1,027 prisoners, many who are serving life sentences for killing Israelis. The Israelis did not release Marwan Barghouti, who was viewed as Abbas's successor, yet they did release Yahya Sinwar, who was a key Hamas figure who would go on to plan the recent October 7th attacks. And so many people at the time, and it wasn't just because of Sinwar, it was really because of Barghouti and Abbas, many people viewed that release as antagonistic to Fatah and Abbas, but also as incredibly lopsided and counterproductive, one person for over 1,000. Going back to the Arab Spring, the elections of the Muslim Brotherhood's Morsi didn't, as Hamas hoped, make Cairo any more friendly than Egypt was under Mubarak, who was no friend of Hamas. They accused the Egyptians accused Hamas of assisting terrorists in an incident where 18 soldiers were killed in the Sinai. So, Hamas kind of botched their relationship with the new Egyptian leadership right away. In November 2012, Gaza erupted again, and the Israelis assassinated the leader of the Popular Resistance Committees and a senior Hamas military commander named Ahmed Jabari. Israeli airstrikes and rocket strikes from Gaza ensued, and this ended 6 days later with an Egyptian brokered ceasefire that prevented a full-scale IDF invasion. In November 2012, Abbas won a big victory when the UN General Assembly upgraded Palestine to a non-member observer status. This status gave Palestine access to organizations like the International Criminal Court, which obviously would be relevant today. Avigdor Lieberman had attacked that effort, apparently without irony, as, quote, diplomatic terrorism. Netanyahu, weeks before another election, announced plans to build thousands of new homes in the West Bank in an east-west corridor called E1, which would bisect the northern and southern parts of the West Bank, and it was the last open space that could allow for a contiguous Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. The Israeli government was providing a lot of incentives at this time to build settlements. They would provide up to $28,000 for each apartment built in a settlement. Often, people would move for financial reasons into these settlements, not just ideological. In Ariel, for example, in 2012, a 4-bedroom home would cost $200,000. The same money would only buy a 2-room apartment in Tel Aviv. So it was, cost effective in a way for people, given the subsidies, to move to these settlements. In 2008, 31% of settlers defined themselves as ultra-Orthodox, 22% lived in the, quote, nationalist religious settlements, and 32% in settlements with a diversity of religious observance. Settlers were powerful. They still are very powerful. By 2010, 1/3 of the IDF infantry officers were drawn from the national religious camp. Avigdor Lieberman, sort of key figure in Netanyahu's coalition, lived in a settlement. And liberals protested in 2011 over the appointment of a Supreme Court judge who lived in a settlement. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz said he, quote, breaks the law every time he goes home. Settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank was common. In 2011, 7,500 olive trees were destroyed. Land occupied by settlements themselves were no more than 3% of the West Bank, though the roads, tunnels, and other infrastructure that supported them accounted for much more land. 42% of the West Bank was in Israeli hands. The Israeli commentator Meron Bienvenisti said that, quote, the Green Line is like a one-way mirror. It's only for the Palestinians, not for the Israelis. Netanyahu's biggest regional foe was Iran. Support for Palestinians and ire for Israel was Iranian policy since the 1979 revolution. Arafat had been handed the keys to the abandoned Israeli embassy in Tehran to use as a mission for the PLO, though Israel did provide weapons to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. It's kind of an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. Israel said Iran provided weapons to Gaza and supported Hezbollah. At the time, years before, in 2003, Iran admitted to a nuclear program, and they had agreed to international inspections and to suspend the enrichment of uranium, which is a constant sort of international debate whether those inspections were actually being carried out properly. In 2005, Iran elected Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was a populist hardline Holocaust denier, and resumed enrichment. This led to the U.S., EU, and UN sanctions. Cyber attacks and assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists ensued, with U.S. and Israeli fingerprints. Constant threats of Israeli unilateral action, it was just a mainstay, continue to be a worry of members of the international community. And in 2012, at the UN, Netanyahu gave a speech where he brandished a drawing of a bomb and drew over it with a red pen, indicating where Israel's red line was. More moderate Iranian leader Hassan Rouhani was elected in 2013, and by the end of the year, the U.S., Iran, and other major powers reached an agreement under the Obama administration, and Iran would curb its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. And in April 2013, Salam Fayyad resigned as prime minister because he was facing too much tension with Abbas and Hamas over both of their corruption. So the Palestinian Authority and Hamas were both corrupt. Fayyad kind of was fighting a losing battle for competence. The U.S. and EU implored Abbas to make it work with Fayyad, to no avail. In 2014, 3 Israeli boys were kidnapped while hitchhiking home from their yeshiva in a West Bank settlement. Israel responded by rearresting many who were freed in the Shalit exchange. Media images in Israel showed Palestinian children holding up 3 fingers to apparently celebrate the abduction. Jerusalem became extremely tense during this period of time and even more divided than it normally was. The bodies of the 3 kids were eventually found near Hebron. Hamas they hailed the killings but denied responsibility. Rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel, and the 3 were buried. This was antagonistic, to say the least. Immediately afterwards, a Palestinian teenager was abducted and killed in East Jerusalem. 3 Israelis, 2 of them teenagers, were given life sentences for the murder. In 2014, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge against Hamas in Gaza. The operation aimed to stop rocket attacks on Israel and destroy Hamas tunnels into Israeli territory. For 50 days, both sides exchanged airstrikes and artillery fire. The conflict resulted in significant civilian casualties, mainly in Gaza. Ceasefire talks mediated by Egypt eventually led to an end to the fighting. In the aftermath, Israel and its critics debated the proportionality and civilian deaths. It's hard to get good info on the ground. The Foreign Press Association issued a statement during the conflict about, quote, blatant, incessant, forceful, and unorthodox intimidation of journalists in the Gaza Strip by Hamas. They said, quote, in several cases, foreign reporters working in Gaza have been harassed, threatened, or questioned over their stories. The Foreign Press Association said this amounted to, quote, denying readers and viewers an objective picture on the ground, adding, we are also aware that Hamas is trying to put in place a vetting procedure that would in effect allow for the blacklisting of specific journalists. So they were saying it was really hard to get good data. The British analyst Alan Johnson said that Israel used a variety of methods that only Israel did to avoid strikes causing civilian casualties. They said those methods included dropping leaflets, texting phone calls to buildings that were going to be bombed, the use of pinpoint precision rockets, and the use of knock-on-the-roof tactics. And the IDF estimates that in that 2014 conflict, 45% of Palestinians dead were combatants and 55% were civilians. Johnson contrasted those ratios with international media and said that recent asymmetric wars, meaning wars between regular armies and irregular terrorist forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, had ratios that were much higher, with 3, 4, or 5 civilians dying for every combatant. So that's their position. There's been a lot of debates and podcasts about this, including a recent interview with, I think it was a West Point expert on the Sam Harris podcast, where he kind of outlined his position on this, and I'll try to find it and put it in our show notes. Shin Bet released admissions by captured Hamas leaders that mosques were used for military activity in tunnels. And that tunnels were built near kindergartens and clinics. This is a big debate, and that basically allegation that Hamas picks civilian targets for their operations to either shield themselves from attack or goad the Israelis into attacking civilian targets. It was hard to gauge support for Hamas during this period of time, but there's some evidence they gained in popularity around that period of time. Raja Sarani of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights called Hamas, quote, part of the Palestinian DNA. The Palestinian analyst Mahoun Rabini suggested that Hamas enjoyed the support of a majority of the Gazan population. In January of 2017, a Palestinian truck drove into a group of IDF cadets and then tried to reverse and run them over again before being shot. The four cadets were dead, 3 of them women. The perpetrator was alleged to be a follower of ISIS, so that not confirmed. Hamas praised the attack, tweeting, quote, we bless the courageous and heroic truck operation in Jerusalem. In February of 2017, the Israeli Knesset voted 60-52 to regularize the status of the Jewish outposts, which were unauthorized settlements built on private Palestinian land in the West Bank. They would eventually be challenged by an Israeli high court, and a Smotrich, who is an outspoken member of parliament for Jewish Home, which spearheaded the legislation, thanked Americans for electing Trump, quote, without whom the law would have probably not passed. That law was condemned by leaders in the center and left in Israel. The Labor Party leader Isaac Herzog warned of a national suicide. Even Dan Mirador, who's a former Likud justice minister, called it evil and dangerous and likely to lead to prosecution of Israeli in the International Criminal Court for breaching the Geneva Conventions. In March of 2015, Netanyahu had won his 4th term by campaigning hard to the right, and Jewish Home, which was the settler party, had a strong performance and was part of his coalition. Naftali Bennett, who is their leader, became the education minister, and Shakid, another member of the party, became the Minister of Justice. So, this is, Netanyahu's government had serious members of the right, the extreme right, settler right, in it. They grew in hostility to left-wing groups internally, including Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, Salem, I don't know how to say that, and Gush Shalom. In 2016, the Knesset passed a law requiring greater transparency for NGOs funded by, quote, foreign government entities. This was condemned by the Obama administration and the EU. In the same year, a poll showed 82% of young Jews believed that there was no chance or barely a chance for peace, and the Palestinians seemed equally pessimistic. a poll from that period of time showed 2/3 believing a two-state solution was no longer possible, and 62% abandoning Oslo. Remember what I said before, I think this was in the last episode, that there was such optimism a decade earlier for Oslo, and now there was none, or maybe more than a decade earlier. The curriculum for Israel's matriculation exams in history and civics avoided all references to the occupation, so internally things were starting to look a little less open. Ami Ayalon, who headed the Shin Bet in the 90s, warned of an incremental tyranny that was undermining Israel's democracy. Carmi Galon, Ayalon's predecessor, who resigned after Rabin's assassination, said the country was being, quote, driven by this occupation towards disaster. Ehud Barak warned the Israeli government was infected with budding fascism. In the autumn of 2015, there was a spate of knife attacks on Israelis in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and ramming attacks. A December poll by the Palestinian Center for Public Policy and Research found 67% of Palestinians supported the knife attacks, and Hamas chose a new leader. It was Yahya Sinwar. Again, this is a guy who figures prominently today. He came from a family of 1948 refugees. He was from the military wing of Hamas. In 1988, he masterminded the abduction and killing of 2 Israeli soldiers and the murder of 4 Palestinians whom he suspected of cooperating with Israel. For that, he was arrested and convicted of murder and sentenced to 4 life sentences in 1989. And again, he was released in that prisoner exchange, the Shalit exchange. He is currently the subject of a manhunt in Israel for his work on October 7th. In December 2017, the U.S. under Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In 2018, demonstrations and violence took place in Gaza along the fence with Israel, including demonstrators hurling rocks and gasoline bombs across the barrier. Israeli troops killed more than 170 Palestinians over several months. In November, Israel staged a covert raid into Gaza. At least 7 suspected Palestinian militants and a senior Israeli officer were killed. From Gaza, hundreds of rockets were fired into Israel. In the spring of 2022, a spat of violence on Israelis by Palestinians left 14 Israelis dead in a handful of attacks between March 22nd and April 8th. In response, Israelis clamped down on militants and activists and launched Break the Wave, which was a military operation in the West Bank, which made 2022 a particularly deadly year. Israeli forces killed 146 Palestinians in the West Bank in 2022, a death toll higher than in any other year since the UN began keeping records in 2005. Palestinians killed 29 Israelis that year. In December 2022, Netanyahu was sworn in for a 6th term in an extremely close election, and he cobbled together what then was now called the most right-wing pro-settler government in Israeli history. And that was essentially the climate for which we basically entered the critical period before October 7th. There's a lot that sort of seeded the ground for October 7th, both within Israel and outside of Israel. And in our Hamas explainer, which we'll link into the show notes, we go through some of that. And if there's interest you can use the comments to tell us. We could do another explainer to go into some of the finer points about what led to October 7th itself. Thank you very much, everybody.